The a most anointed new goddess, the most anointed old god, the most anointed old gods, a most anointed old god, the most anointed old goddess, the most anointed old goddesses, a most anointed old goddess, the most anointed greater god, the most anointed greater gods, a most anointed greater god, the most anointed greater goddess, the most anointed greater goddesses, a most anointed greater goddess, the most anointed lesser god, the most anointed lesser gods, a most anointed lesser god, the most anointed lesser goddess, the most anointed lesser goddesses, a most anointed lesser goddess, the most anointed greater spirit, the most anointed greater spirits, a most anointed greater spirit, the most anointed lesser spirit, the most anointed lesser spirits, a most anointed lesser spirit, the most anointed major god, the most anointed major gods, a most anointed major god, the most anointed major goddess, the most anointed major goddesses, a most anointed major goddess, the most anointed minor god, the most anointed minor gods, a most anointed minor god, the most anointed minor goddess, the most anointed minor goddesses, a most anointed minor goddess, the most anointed superior god, the most anointed superior gods, a most anointed superior god, the most anointed superior goddess, the most anointed superior goddesses, a most anointed superior goddess, the most anointed inferior god, the most anointed inferior gods, a most anointed inferior god, the most anointed inferior goddess, the most anointed inferior goddesses, a most anointed inferior goddess, the most anointed ancestor god, the most anointed ancestor gods, a most anointed ancestor god, the most anointed ancestor goddess, the most anointed ancestor goddesses, a most anointed ancestor goddess, the most anointed ascendant god, the most anointed ascendant gods, a most anointed ascendant god, the most anointed ascendant goddess, the most anointed ascendant goddesses, a most anointed ascendant goddess, the most anointed descendant god, the most anointed descendant gods, a most anointed descendant god, the most anointed descendant goddess, the most anointed descendant goddesses, a most anointed descendant goddess, the most anointed transcendent god, the most anointed transcendent gods, a most anointed transcendent god, the most anointed transcendent goddess, the most anointed transcendent goddesses, a most anointed transcendent goddess, the most anointed future god, the most anointed future gods, a most anointed future god, the most anointed future goddess, the most anointed future goddesses, a most anointed future goddess, the most anointed present god, the most anointed present gods, a most anointed present god, the most anointed present goddess, the most anointed present goddesses, a most anointed present goddess, the most anointed past god, the most anointed past gods, a most anointed past god, the most anointed past goddess, the most anointed past goddesses, a most anointed past goddess, the most anointed god, the most anointed gods, a most anointed god, the most anointed goddess, the most anointed goddesses, a most anointed goddess, the most anointed half god, the most anointed half gods, a most anointed half god, the most anointed half goddess, the most anointed half goddesses, a most anointed half goddess, the most anointed vessel, the most anointed vessels, a most anointed vessel, the most anointed person, the most anointed persons, a most anointed person, the most anointed image, the most anointed images, a most anointed image, the most anointed belief, the most anointed beliefs, a most anointed belief, the most anointed thought, the most anointed thoughts, a most anointed thought, the most anointed word, the most anointed words, a most anointed word, the most anointed action, the most anointed actions, a most anointed action, the most anointed situation, the most anointed situations, a most anointed situation, the most anointed circumstance, the most anointed circumstances, a most anointed circumstance, the most anointed relationship, the most anointed relationships, a most anointed relationship, the most anointed number, the most anointed numbers, a most anointed number, the most anointed formula, the most anointed formulas, a most anointed formula, the most anointed symbol, the most anointed symbols, a most anointed symbol, the most anointed color, the most anointed colors, a most anointed color, the most anointed thing, the most anointed things, a most anointed thing, the most anointed way, the most anointed ways, a most anointed way, the most anointed place, the most anointed places, a most anointed place, the most anointed time, the most anointed times, a most anointed time, the most anointed event, the most anointed events, a most anointed event, the most anointed result, the most anointed results, a most anointed result,